Sorry about that. I fucking accidentally stopped the recording. Oh my god, there's gonna be two parts of this. Congratulations. Oh my god. Anyways, so what we have to essentially understand here is that what Karl Marx essentially does advocate here, and what Karl Marx essentially understands of here, is the fact that this entire function and this entire way of production, and entirely of the individual, or like kind of what we essentially understand of labor vouchers in this instance, is the fact that this labor vouchers, and that labor vouchers is essentially not entirely of a means of money or a medium of money, or the existence of a ruling class. Rather is onto the material is rather by society's material insensitive, and to one's ability and to one's work. Because it so that way it can essentially evolve itself into a higher phase of communism. And what is this higher phase of communism? Quote, and well, Karl Marx even explains it here as well in the same section of what is higher phase of communism. In a higher phase of quote, in a higher phase of communist society, after the enslavement and subordination of the individual division of labor, is 12 onto the antithesis between mental and physical labor, and the vanish after labor has become not only the means of life of the prime's wants, but after the productive forces has also increased with all around development of the individual and all springs of cooperative wealth flow more indubitably only then onto the narrow horizon of bourgeois right on the cross of the internally in society inscribed of its banners, from each according to his ability, to each according to his needs. End quote. Karl Marx. So, yeah, no, Permanent revolution here, or essentially what we understand of well, we're talking about socialism and communism. Essentially, what we understand of socialism and communism is still one of a moneyless, classless, stateless society. The only difference here is really on how the mode of distribution is essentially carried out within its economic functions. That's essentially what we have to essentially understand here, and that for some reason, essentially a lot of neoconservatives essentially fail to understand here. So let's also let's also basically deconstruct a lot of things onto this function. So what we essentially understand here, the question of socialism and like permanent revolution, is the fact that it's not entirely a foreign policy, rather is upon to the development of the Marxist theory. So not only is this is entirely false in itself. Furthermore, I entirely hate this kind of like premise of like just like of like kind of like a bias against the entirety of the Soviet Union. Again, and I know I'm not necessarily expecting this, because alternate history is essentially is an idealist kind of like argument, is basically just an argument between one idealist to another, or kind of like a question of one idealist to another, regardless. Which, yeah, even as a Marxist materialist, I basically just heavily just do not essentially agree with, or essentially sway upon this at all. But what we have to essentially understand here is essentially what Cody from Alternate History Hub is basically trying to, I guess, trying to imply here, is that entirely that it will be Leon Trotsky's fault, or that we will be in a worse society under Leon Trotsky, if Leon Trotsky had took over and not Joseph Stalin, and that Joseph Stalin was essentially, I guess, practically onto like during times of World War II, it practically would essentially be the best choice of the factor in the entirely historically, if we actually look into World War II, which we can just see is just is not only false. It's just not only false, because the entirety of Leon Trotsky's and his entire like idea was that it was to be anti-war and to not even participate in the entireties of war in the first is not to participate in entirety of wars in the first place. Furthermore, he said. Furthermore, he tried to characterize as Trotsky being someone that essentially that wanted to invade, regardless of the entirety of question of invade, whether it would be a good idea or not. This is just completely false. If you know if you know about the Polish-Soviet War of the 1920s, you will know for a fact this is entirely false, or at least under the context of what Trotsky, his opinion about the Polish-Soviet War, even before it happened, would essentially be. And that he even says to Lenin, this idea onto invading Poland, the invasion of Poland, is not essentially the best one. Nationalism has grown significantly within Poland, and has essentially grown into a significance by which they can be no different than the entirety of the fascism that has developed recently as well into Italy. Is essentially young and is essentially new, and we cannot and we ourselves as communists cannot essentially be able to challenge this based onto their force that the entirety of the population essentially has developed within it, and onto a state bureaucracy that is also taking control onto the head of Poland at this time. Trotsky says this to Lenin. At this point, yes, Trotsky would be in opposition to Lenin, and for honestly, I would say, yeah, good reason. Because if we can look at the Polish-Soviet War, it was a massive failure. It was a failure into the Soviets' part. It was. It absolutely was. There, Stalin dissuaded from the entirety of the plan. There was less entire organizing for the entirety of the proletarian militia to invade. There is entirely entirely distribution for proletarian militants to in the invasion of Poland was essentially delayed, and yes, so many factors were essentially developed. But what we essentially have to understand here, what led to this failure, wasn't even up by Stalin. Into Stalin's reason onto the failed invasion. Stalin essentially there was a plan to essentially take Warsaw in a matter of instance. Regardless, Stalin being Stalin and wanted to essentially take control of the entirety, the general secretary wanted to take control and be legitimate as possible. Essentially kind of disagreed with this and essentially derailed from the plan itself, and instead of rendezvousing his entire regiment of proletarian militants to Warsaw, he instead essentially demand them to essentially take Lugnet, which even then the entirety of regiments entirely of Warsaw were essentially under equipped and essentially need entirely of more men to be able to win the entirety of the battle, which obviously was not essentially done because of Stalin's opportunism towards Lugnet. Which entirely led to the Battle of Warsaw under the Soviet Union, essentially being a massive failure onto the Soviets' part and leading to a retreat and leading to a flank onto Stalin's regiment into the north, which led to the other regiment and the other units of proletarian militants to also retreat as well. This was the actual failure between the entirety in the Polish-Soviet War as well. And even then, Trotsky literally just went to Lenin and basically just said, "I told you so." Like after the Soviet War, and even then, this is essentially the turning point where Lenin essentially conceded and admitted that Trotsky was right all along about this. Again, I'm not essentially trying to discredit Lenin here at all. I don't at all. I do agree with Lenin onto this instance. However, we're talking about historically on what happened, and we can even see historically that Trotsky was essentially the kind of person to stop an invasion or to disagree with kind of an invasion plan, rather if it is a bad idea or not, or to even try and stop it, which he even did. And he did essentially debate this with Lenin, and even then he would essentially be proven to be correct, once this has been proven into practice within the Polish-Soviet War. Period. Like that, we're talking about historically here. We're talking about historically. This is Cynical Historian. This is Alternate History Hub. Of course, this is alternate history, but history regardless. And this is essentially did what happened, regardless of how you put it. Again, I don't disagree with Lenin. Lenin is a great person. I do consider myself a Leninist. However, if you are going to say that, if you are going to try to say that, essentially, Lenin was correct upon onto the invasion of Poland, which he himself even essentially conceded on, then I'd say you're wrong. Even to any I guess Stalinist or any form of this, or even especially here, to Alternate History Hub, to Cody from Alternate History Hub, and Cypher the Cynical Historian. So, anyways, moving on.
As such a myth surrounding him, he fostered it himself before discovering what an ice pick felt like, but a parody account
Haha, ice pick. Haha, ice pick joke. That is so funny, dude. That is so original, bro. I am laughing hard, bro. Dude, that is funny. But no, seriously, I don't know. Trotsky himself never essentially tried to make himself at least seem great or any of these things. Even his own works, he essentially just had a critique of the USSR and essentially what he wanted to essentially happen. Not essentially under him, but just what he wanted in general, or essentially what he thought would be better. Not just him essentially implemented it. He didn't even want to take power. He himself admitted that. Even his enemies admitted that. Bukharin even admitted that. So yeah, regardless, like he wouldn't essentially have done that either way. Regardless, let's move on because there's a very section that essentially is important to understanding here.
To the Soviet system really drove home this idea that Trotsky could have saved 20th century communism. As we've seen, he was just as prone to inhumanity as Stalin, if
No, he's not. But I don't know what to say. He wasn't. He critiqued entirely of like Stalinism for its kind of like inhumane ethics and its inhumane bureaucracy. So no, no, absolutely not. And even then, what he essentially advocated for, even before he was exiled of the Bolshevik Party as well, and even after as well. So no, no, he wasn't.
not more so. But Orson Welles just had to stick his pen in it. He wrote Animal Farm during World War II, and
George
literally
Orwell. All right, George Orwell. Like we're assuming that entirely that we should take George Orwell seriously. I don't know what to tell
2
you.
days after the war ended, and the USSR no longer an ally, he released it. The book depicts the Soviet ruling class through an allegory of animals on a farm overthrowing their farmer and the subsequent power struggle to decide how equality is sorted out. Eventually, the pigs come to rule, stating that everyone is equal, but some are more equal. There was a glimmer of hope for everyone to actually see a good form of socialism in the Trotsky-like character who eventually gets run off. This is where the myth comes from. Trotsky formed the Fourth International after his exile, and it lives on as the standard bearer for what vanguard communism could have been. They're still active and under the guise of Trotsky's supposed promise, often working closely with what came to be known as the New Left. They're so influential that members who opposed the counterculture of the 1960s began their own form of conservatism, now called neocons. So literally both sides of current American politics were heavily influenced by this myth.
Well, not even that, but even then, neoconservatism is not even like proponent onto Trotskyism at all. It's there like I don't know where people even get this myth. I even debated entirely with Trotskyists as well about this. I don't know where people essentially get this from, but it's just simply not true. Neoconservatism does reject entendre like Trotskyism down to its very functions. The only way that they can essentially you can try and characterize it is in a way which is very weird onto like the Trotskyist comrade that I was essentially talking with about this was the fact that they were trying to say, oh, instead of like socialist permanent revolution, they wanted a capitalist permanent revolution. That okay, that's not permanent revolution though. That's under the assumption that capitalism hasn't been established though. But capitalism clearly is established. We have entirely been exploitation of labor power. We have an exploitation of the working class. We have an exploitation of the working class. We have an exploitation of the proletariat. We have capital. We have commodity production, generalized commodity production. We have all of these factors that essentially create entirely capitalism. But you're trying to say that this is not the case, or like them trying to say that this is not the case. This is then just say okay, that's not permanent revolution. That's not capitalist permanent revolution. Then that's just acceleration of capitalism. They're not Trotskyists. This is not the branch of Trotskyism. This is not right wing Trotskyism or any of that function. No, no. That's not that. This isn't just neoconservatism. This is just modern day neoconservatism and what they essentially want to accelerate of capitalism. That's really it. That's really all there is. That's all we essentially characterize of this entirely. I don't know where entirely people have like get this idea, and if you entirely try to argue this to me or to any Trotskyist, I can assure you that you need to do more reading. Just saying, you just need to do more reading. Period. And not as an insult, but just in general. It's just like a recommendation. Just do more reading, man. But even then, we also have to ask the question of George Orwell and like what he essentially characterized onto like even Trotsky as well. George Orwell, being George Orwell, was just entirely of a British author that did develop the Animal Farm. Was essentially supposed to like basically describe entirely of Animal Farm as like a as of a good as just kind of like a recommend like kind of like a representation or I guess a play book of just Soviet history and the Soviet Union after they overthrew their farmers, right? But even then, what we can essentially understand here is that is that this entire idea that that essentially George Orwell even liked Trotsky was even not the case at all. Literally. Even then, it's like we're supposed to even take George Orwell seriously. The fact that he's developing his entire theory or his critique of the Soviet Union through a fantasy book, through a fantasy story. I agree. George Orwell is an idiot. He's an absolute idiot. He's an absolute buffoon onto the understanding of the Russian history. I agree on that. However, does not mean that he even liked Trotsky either. He essentially criticized Trotsky and essentially even tried to make Trotsky look as also, even what cynical historian even here is saying, as another dictator as well. He's trying to make him look like that. When the case is here is that he would essentially just be another dictator and wouldn't be another essential Stalin in any way, shape, or form. It's just like with more like globalist policies or whatever the fuck it is, what the fuck they're coming up with next. No, the fact is here is that this was essentially on the question of Marxism onto the entirety of proletarian democracy and the entirety of the organization of the proletariat themselves would take control onto the productive forces in the entirety of the Marxist context or onto the economical context of the Soviet Union within this. That's really all that needs to be said here entirely when we actually look at things historically and we actually have to essentially apply this to essentially things in the past, present, and how this can also be done through the future onto our entire material conditions of today as well. Anyways, moving on.
Trotsky could sit on the sidelines complaining about Stalin, but when push comes to shove, he was no better.
What pushed the shove though? He never essentially had the power to essentially give onto this power. And this is actually something I forgot to essentially mention about the entire workers generals. If you actually go back when Cody from Alternate History Hub, not such a cool historian here, but when from Cody from Alternate History Hub in the part 1 series, he essentially goes into like depth of what essentially is to come under like this of like under this kind of like idea that a that Trotsky essentially used oligarchs from the Tsarist regime to essentially train the entirety of the proletarian militia to make them an effective force to fight against the White Army. When even then, what we essentially characterize as the old guard is even then these old guards essentially removing themselves from power and essentially abiding onto the Soviet state. So that's essentially the context here, and that is why Trotsky essentially implemented old guards within the very functions of the Soviet Union here. That's just really what happened entirely. Like I don't really know what to say here except that yeah, this is entirely the case. If you want to consider that as push to shove, then I wouldn't because entirely these people themselves have already dissuaded their entire basis of their ideological principles in the past to essentially go forth into the proletariat state, into the workers' state that has essentially been established within the Soviet Union. That is essentially the context here, and this is why we shouldn't count this as push comes to shove. If you are to, no, this should just be counted as of military strategy. If anything, this should just be called as a militant strategy because at the very least Trotsky had strategy, which is something that Stalin obviously did not.
By the way, if you want to hear some more about Soviet history myths, come check out my video on the subject, coming out today too.
Oh, that's interesting. That's actually something. I'm probably gonna do actually a video into response to that because I essentially watched it earlier as well. And there's actually some things that essentially I essentially dislike. So hopefully I'll be able to essentially upload kind of like a thing of that soon. Be on the lookout for that. Be on the lookout for that if you're on my notification. If you're in my notification ping. Um. If you're in my notification kind of like mailing thing, whatever it is, whatever it's called, notification squad. I'm not gonna call it that. It's stupid. Notification squad, Jesus. But yeah, no. And it seems as if this is entirely the end of the video, actually. So hold on. Yeah, this is the entire the end of the video, and he basically just ends it all with like, yeah, this is just an alternate scenario. What do you think essentially happened? What do you think would essentially happen? And this is just entirely my point. Exactly. This is an idealist argument. This is just an idealist questioning onto history that is exclusively not idealist in nature. So I don't know what to say. So I don't really know what to say here except like it's just an idealist questioning something that is just materialist in nature, which cannot be, which is just like, oh my god, it's alternate history entirely. It's kids playing with the textbook of history. That's basically what we can essentially understand here. And so I guess what I have to really say here is that I hope I essentially cleared up a lot of misconceptions, or essentially kind of like, I guess basically cleared up a lot of things that essentially Trotsky, essentially, would have been characterized in this video for, and what he actually was and was not entirely. So, yeah. Anyways, thank you for watching this video. If you're new to my channel, hit the subscribe button down below. I really appreciate it. If you're new to my channel, hit the subscribe button. If you're new to my channel, hit the subscribe button. I would very much appreciate it. If you like this video, hit the like button. I'll definitely appreciate that. If you want to essentially get notified onto like a video, especially when I mentioned I was gonna upload like kind of like a video responding to Cynical Historia about like history myth, 10 like Soviet history myths, then I'll definitely get down with that, for sure. Excuse me. But yeah, anyways, thank you for watching this video, and yeah, Socialist Links is out.